big round of applause to welcome sir. Hello everyone, I'm Kalyani Gupta, a first year economics student, and on behalf of Caucus, the Discussion Forum and International Cell of Hindu College, I extend a warm welcome to our next speaker for the day, Mr. William Dalrymple, and our moderators, Ms. Mudita Mishra and Ms. Meghna Rathod. In 2019, Sir released his most ambitious work today, which we are discussing today, the Anarchy, the Relentless Rise of the East India Company. Sir gives a new character-driven account to the ascent of power of the East India Company, following the collapse of the Mughal Empire and the resulting anarchy that followed. Tracking the company's ruthless profiteering and territorial conquests, the Anarchy is not only a fine addition to Dalrymple's study of the emergence of British rule in India, but also promotes reflection of the dangers of corporate excesses in our present. The Anarchy doesn't necessarily seek to radically retell the history of the company or push a new argument or debate. It's about the way Sir recounts the story. William Dalrymple is the best-selling author of the Woolson Prize-winning White Mughals, The Last Mughal, which won the Duff Cooper Prize, and the Hemingway and Prize-winning Return of a King. His most recent book, The Anarchy, was long-listed for the Baillie Gifford Prize in 2019 and shortlisted for the Duke of Wellington Medal for Military Honor, the Tata Book of the Year Non-Fiction, and the Historical Writers Association Book Award 2020. It was a finalist for the Cundall Prize for History and won the 2020 Arthur Ross Medal from the US Council on Foreign Relations. Dalrymple has been awarded 5 honorary doctorates, is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the Royal Asiatic Society, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and has held visiting fellowships at Princeton, Brown, and Oxford. In 2018, he was presented with the prestigious President's Medal by the British Academy and was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers for 2020 by Prospect. He is founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literature Festival. Without any further ado, let us start the discussion as we navigate to an informed tomorrow. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, you would be surprised to know that just last month, we visited the Jaipur Literature Fest and we got to see your show. And it was an amazing show and we got to resolve that we would host you here at Hindu College. So, we are so honored to have you here.
Thank you very much. I live so close to here. And bizarrely, I'm always lecturing around the world at Harvard or Oxford. I very rarely get invited even to JNU, which is just 5 minutes from where I live. So it's a very nice opportunity to come back. And it was lovely going around the, up through the ridge coming here. I did all my research for Last Mughal, all the places like the Flagstaff Tower and the Mutiny Memorial, and all these old places I used to hang around. I've been here for years, so thank you for the opportunity to come up. Are you going to ask questions now? Because I have got a lecture. I'm happy to do either or both. What would you like me to do an introductory?
So, we would like you to do a presentation first, followed by a moderated discussion.
Sure, great. Should we go straight on to the presentation, or do you want to? Huh? How long have we got? An hour in all? I will gallop through the presentation, and then we can sit down back again here and chat. Very good. Okay. Go straight in. How do I control the slides? Is there a... I just say next slide. Okay, well, next slide. I'll give you this back. Next slide, please. So I'd like to start a long way from the ridge, a long way from Delhi, and perhaps a surprising place to start a talk on the East India Company. But this is Powys Castle on the Welsh-English border. As you can see, it's a very English site with nice Tudor box hedges and a Renaissance portal. But go inside and you see a very different site. Next slide. Because within the long galleries of Powys, there is more loot from Mughal India than exists in any collection in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan or Bangladesh. There are fantastic rooms full of armor and talwars and Indian robes, gorgeous miniature paintings. Next slide. Even Sirajuddau's palanquin abandoned on the battlefield of Plassey, which we're looking through here. We're looking through the glass palanquin where Siraj would have sat on his way to Plassey, not knowing what was about to happen in the way we do. And then if you go through the arch at the end of that room on the left, you find yourself in a room with Tipu Sultan's campaign tent. Now, what is all this Mughal loot doing in the middle of the British countryside? Well, the answer to that becomes apparent in a painting which you have to walk under to enter this khazana, this treasury. Next slide. And here is the painting. It's not a very good painting, but what it shows is of the greatest historical importance. What you see there by a painter called Benjamin West, who'd never been to India and was working entirely from his imagination and produced an image which is very far from the actual historical truth, but may have been close to the truth that the East India Company wished to put out, is that you have Shah Alam in the center handing a document to this slightly portly figure in a red coat, and that man is Robert Clive. And this is what was known, I suppose, euphemistically by the company as the gifting of the Diwali, as if it was a sort of Diwali present, a present generously given to the company. In actual fact, the reality of this was that Shah Alam had just been defeated at the Battle of Buxar and had no option but to hand over to Clive whatever he wanted. And the ceremony we see here taking place in public Darbar, in fact, took place in the privacy of Clive's tent. No one was watching, and Shah Alam was bullied into signing a document which, crucially, gave away the right to manage the finances of what was then the three richest provinces of the Mughal Empire: Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Now, today when we think of the Mughals, we tend to imagine the Bollywood version. We think of Aishwarya Rai dropping mangoes into Akbar's mouth from some scene in a Bollywood drama with fluttering pigeons and kabutar fluttering away. But the reality was that all that riches and money came from a very strong industrial base. And in the mid-18th century, despite the fact that the Mughal Empire was in the process of falling apart, Bengal had about 1 million looms that were producing a great deal of the wealth that made the Mughal Empire produce very nearly 40% of the world's gross domestic product. When the company was started, England just produced around 7% of world GDP in contrast. And so by handing over the wealth of these three incredibly rich provinces to not the British government, and this is a crucial distinction, but to a private corporation, Shah Alam was giving away one of the main sources of his wealth and giving it over to a private company. Next slide. And the East India Company was a company in the same way that Google or PVR or Facebook or any other company is a corporation. It exists only to make a profit, it exists to enrich its shareholders and give employment to its employees. And it existed based out of one office. At the time of the Battle of Plassey, this was the office. Look how modest it is. It's a lot smaller than Hindu College. It's even smaller than this auditorium. And it is just, not even the two buildings on the side of this slide, it's just the 5 windows in the middle. Slightly set back from the street behind railings, just 3 stories high, 5 windows wide. And this is something very, very odd in history. India, like most countries, has had invading armies coming in from the sea or down from the mountains. But in this case, it's taken over at a moment when it is the richest country in the world, whatever its political problems, by a corporation that exists only to make a profit. Next slide. So where does it all begin? In 1599, this man, Sir Thomas Smythe, known as Auditor Smythe, calls a public meeting. And the day before, next slide, he has persuaded these men to raise a sum of money. And you can actually see how much every single one has given. If you look at the first entry, it says Mayor of London, and he's given £200, and so on down the list. This list goes on, survives in the British Library, and it goes on for about 20 pages. By the end, you have a lot of minor investing by small shopkeepers, people who call themselves haberdashers, or vintners, or leather workers. And what is happening here is a new form of corporate entity has been invented. Not, in fact, with the company, but shortly before with the Muscovy Company, which in 1550 was the first corporate chartered joint stock company. The difference between, say, a guild where lots of different leather workers or wool merchants come together in a corporation and a joint stock company is that you don't have to work for the company. You don't have to be a leather worker or a vintner and actually give your time. All you do is invest your money and you get a share of the profits. And this was a new invention. It meant that if you had a company that was doing well, everyone would invest in it, and you could accumulate a vast amount of capital very quickly. This was a new idea. It didn't exist in the Middle Ages. It didn't exist in India or Asia. It's an idea which comes up out of Elizabethan London at the time that Shakespeare is writing. The same year that the East India Company is formed in Moorgate Fields, Shakespeare is writing Hamlet about a mile away in the Globe Theatre in South London. Next slide. And having gathered all this money, they employ this man, James Lancaster, to sail to the East Indies to buy spices. Now, Lancaster was not necessarily the best possible choice in that he had already tried to get to Indonesia and sunk. And the ship in the top left-hand corner is the ship that he managed to sink. But he was the only person that knew the way, so they employed him. They went down to Deptford, where they found a whole load of old pirate ships, and bought one called the Scourge of Malice. This was a period when the English had a large, what was politely called privateering fleet, which meant basically pirates. I mean, think Pirates of the Caribbean in real life. The Scourge of Malice was renamed the Red Dragon to make it sound slightly less aggressive, and off it sailed. And eventually, 6 months later, it arrives in the East Indies, which is what we today would call Indonesia, just off Batavia, which is just off modern Jakarta. There they see a Portuguese ship coming the opposite direction, and because all the staff are ex-pirates, they simply board the Portuguese ship, transfer the contents, a lot of spices, into their own hold and sail back to England. And they sell the contents for £1 million. And that profit gets the whole East India Company going. Next slide. They buy a new corporate headquarters, always on the same site in Leadenhall Street, all the way through the story. But in this first incarnation, it looks rather like a kind of Elizabethan pub. And this with nice sort of jolly pictures of ships on the high seas. And this is the base from which operations are conducted. Now initially, the East India Company does not do well. It's in competition with the Dutch, and the business it's chosen to be in is importing spices. But the Dutch have deeper pockets, better banking systems, a much more efficient stock exchange, and banking and financial support, and better ships. And by the 1640s, the English basically lose the battle of competition with the Dutch. The Dutch actually defeat them also in a naval battle. And the treaty is signed, whereby the English East India Company basically hands over the spice trade to the Dutch, and in return, as a sop, they're given a small island in the Hudson River in America, on the other side of the world, called Manhattan, modern New York. And that's the outcome of this. And at this point only, in 1640, it's now, the Taj Mahal is coming up in Agra, Shah Jahan is on the throne. The English turn their attention away from the spice trade and the East Indies, in other words, Indonesia, and they divert their attention for the first time to India and begin sending the first ships to Surat in Gujarat. And this turns out to be a good move. This is the period of the Mughals. They have fantastic industrial production of textiles, particularly out of the East Coast, but they don't have a navy. So the British, the French, and the Dutch all compete to ship Mughal textiles around the world. It's the British who basically win that battle. And by the mid-18th century, their new settlements of Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay are all thriving. Calcutta in particular is an incredibly rich port, where despite very high mortality rates among the Europeans, huge amounts of money are being made by the exporting of Mughal textiles. So much, for example, that there's de-industrialization in Mexico by the amount of imported Indian cotton, which is better quality and cheaper than being produced in Mexico, but it isn't Indian shippers who are creaming off the profits, it's the East India Company. And so things progress very profitably for the company until Aurangzeb falls off his perch in 1707. Next slide. Now Aurangzeb, as you all know, highly controversial character. Next slide, please. Here's the East India Company by this stage now has its own dock where it's building its own ships. Next slide. Here's Aurangzeb. So Aurangzeb, whatever his other pros and cons as a ruler, and he's a guy that has few members of his fan club, shall we say, in modern India, particularly in the government, but he is nonetheless a man that extends Mughal rule to its furthest extent, so much so that it then sort of implodes catastrophically after his death. And next slide. By the mid-1720s, everything is going wrong. The Marathas have erupted from their hills and are not only burning Maharashtra, but have raided deep into Madhya Pradesh and even raided the main Mughal port at Surat. Meanwhile, south of Delhi, in the Doab, the Jats are rising up and creating a lot of fuss and bother around Deeg and so on, while the Sikhs are rising up against the Mughals in the Punjab. So it's all beginning to crash, but Delhi, sitting in the middle, is like a big ripe mango waiting to fall into somebody's lap, and no one knows is it going to be the Marathas, is it going to be the Jats, is it going to be the Sikhs? And in the end, it's none of those, because in 1739, next slide, and we'll go through 2 or 3 slides quickly. This is gorgeous images of 18th century Delhi, Chandni Chowk, then one of the most elegant, broad streets in the world, with this canal running down the center. Next slide. Anyway, in 1739, this character turns up, Nadir Shah of Persia. Nadir Shah is basically a self-made military leader. He has taken over the Safavid army, then conducted a military coup, and overtaken the Safavids to become the ruler of Persia himself. But he's a military genius. He's invented something called the swivel gun. You can see one in the National Museum upstairs, which is like a sort of tank gun of its day. It has a huge lead slug which can pierce any armor. And with that, he then invades first Afghanistan and then the main Mughal territories south of the Khyber Pass. And no one, though he's only got a small force of 160,000 forces, no one can stop him. And finally, on the plain of Karnal, next slide, he defeats Muhammad Shah Rangila, who has an army, a vast army of 1 million men, and this small crack force of elite troops from Persia defeat them. He then invites Muhammad Shah Rangila to dinner, and Muhammad Shah Rangila idiotically accepts, and is then arrested at the end of dinner, not allowed to go back to his own camp. The next day, Nadir Shah marches him into Delhi, and a rape and loot of Delhi commences. There's a massacre, there's an uprising, there's a massacre, and as part of the punitive taxes imposed on Delhi as a result, in 6 weeks later, when Nadir Shah leaves, he leaves with 8,000 wagons of jewels and gold, including the Peacock Throne, into which is embedded both the Koh-i-Noor and the Darya-Noor, which is its slightly larger sister, which is still in Tehran. And with the treasury emptied, the Mughal Empire just disintegrates. It's like a mirror that you throw out of a top-story window. It shatters into a million fragments. And it's like every single state in India becomes independent. Jaipur, Jodhpur, Udaipur, Hyderabad, Tanjore, all these different states where previously you had one enormous mega empire, suddenly you have this anarchy of competing city-states. And the people who make the most of this are not the Marathas, although they do obviously conquer great swathes of territory. It is the two European companies. Next slide. And these are the French. It looks like a gay pride parade, but this is actually the cutting-edge military outfit of its day. These sexy little French shorts are the sepoys, who are trained in new military technology, and they import from Prussia new principles of warfare that involve horse artillery and firing by infantry troops rather than cavalry warfare. And it's tried out for the first time in India in the 1740s, in south of Madras, and then in the Carnatic Wars. And it's found that these new military techniques can defeat any Indian army. But it's not until Plassey that this really gets going. So the background to Plassey, next slide, is Siraj-ud-Dowlah rides off and takes over to Calcutta because the East India Company has not consulted him about rebuilding its walls. The reason they rebuilt the walls is that they actually want to go to war with the French. The 7-Year War is about to break out. Any of you ever seen that movie, Last of the Mohicans? That's what the war that's about to break out. All those Indians crossing Native Americans crossing Lake Huron. And there is a mess up with intelligence. The East India Company believes that a French fleet has left for Bengal. In fact, it's left for America. And they send off a fleet in pursuit of it. In charge of the Marines is this man. Next slide, Robert Clive. And Clive, who's fought the Carnatic Wars, is sent back to fight the French, but arrives in Madras to find that there are no French. They've in fact sailed off to Canada. So he's twiddling his thumbs, wondering what to do, when the news comes that Siraj-ud-Dowlah has taken Calcutta. It's a complete accident. Any other time, Siraj-ud-Dowlah would have been able to hold Calcutta, and the company would never have probably got it back. But by a series of errors, one of the kind of cock-ups of history, Clive is there with his fleet with nothing to do, and he goes off to liberate Calcutta. And again, this is a sign of how much accident and error often plays a crucial role in history. It certainly does here. So Clive goes back to Calcutta, he retakes it from Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and at that point, he gets a crucial letter, which you will not read about in any of the normal nationalist Indian textbooks. The letter is from the Jagat Seths, who are the great bankers of Bengal. And they employed Clive to get rid of Siraj-ud-Dowlah in a palace coup. Plassey is fought on the payment of these Marwari bankers who want to get rid of Siraj-ud-Dowlah because, for very good reason, he's a psycho. And if you read the Anarchy, you'll see some of the things he gets up to. So without consulting his bosses, Clive goes off and fights Siraj-ud-Dowlah, but the main general of Siraj, next slide, here is the kind of conventional picture of heroic Clive winning Plassey. It's total nonsense. In actual fact, it's a stitch-up. Next slide. Mir Jafar, the main general of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, is also in the pay of the Jagat Seths. Both have taken Marwari money to do a palace coup, and when the battle takes place, Mir Jafar leaves the battlefield, and Clive marches in to claim his check from the Jagat Seths. which is, in 18th century money, £1 million, which instantly makes him the richest self-made man in Europe. But very important to realize, this is not his orders. He's been ordered to fight the French. He hasn't been ordered to fight Siraj ad-Dowlah. And he takes Murshidabad entirely on part of a plot cooked up by the Jugged Sets. But having taken it, he is incredibly rich. The company now has got a controlling influence in Bengal. And next slide, a few years later, 57 is Plassey, 65 is the Battle of Buxar. The company defeats not only the Shah Alam, but also the new Nawab of Bengal and the Nawab of Awadh. And they find in 1765 that they've now got control of the whole of North India. No one had planned this, it wasn't expected, but they're now incredibly powerful. And the reason they're so powerful is their mercenary army. Next slide. The terrible truth is that the East India Company do not conquer India with white British troops. They conquer it with Indian mercenaries, paid for with money borrowed from Indian bankers. It's a truth that would be unbelievable today. How does it possibly happen? It happens because the bankers simply see that there's more economic opportunity, talking the same language as the financiers of the East India Company. They don't see any reason why they should support other Indian powers in different parts of the country. So consistently, the East India Company has the support of the banking community who compete to lend them money. With the money that they borrow, they buy a mercenary army, and with the mercenary army, they defeat Tipu, the Marathas, and everyone else up to 1803 when they finally take Delhi. And they use huge amounts of their land revenue from Bengal and from UP to enlarge the size of their army. At the time of Plassey, there are about 6,000 sepoys. At the time of Buxar, there are about 20,000. By the end of the century, by 1799, next slide, the East India Company forces are 200,000 Indian sepoys strong, at a time when the British Army, the state army, controlled by the government, by the Foreign Office, and the government of Britain is only 100,000 strong. In other words, the East India Company, a private corporation, has a military force double the size of the state army in Britain. Extraordinary, weird piece of history. You have a corporation that has a private army that is double the size of its host nation. Meanwhile, officials are fanning out across India, where they realize they no longer have to import gold to buy the textiles and all the things they want to buy in India. They just use land revenue to buy the textiles and ship it home. So the profits are vast. They're not having to produce any money to buy the stuff here. They're just taxing Indians to buy it. And then they realize that they can use the farmland in Bihar and Bengal to produce opium. So they become the largest narco operator in history. If you get the Medellin cartel of Pablo Escobar or any of that kind of stuff, this is on a far vaster scale. They then use the opium to buy tea in China, illegally. They sell the opium, they buy tea, and they use the tea, next slide, to sell it to India and Europe and to America. And this is East India Company tea, which is poured into Boston Harbor at the beginning of the American Revolution. So you now have the East India Company growing from this small company of a bunch of ex-pirates knocking around in a tiny little office in London to this vast initial multinational corporation, the first big multinational. And just as today we sometimes fear the power of Facebook or Google, so in the 18th century you have the precursor of all these, the East India Company, which isn't just a military threat, it also is a political threat, because it realizes what big corporations realize everywhere else in the world, including, of course, here in India, that big corporations can actually fund and change the nature of politics. So just as quite arguably it was corporate donations from Tatas and Adani and Reliance which helped create the initial money which brought the BJP to power, and you can tell similar stories for Trump and for other parties elsewhere in the world. So the East India Company realizes that it can use lobbying to raise money to corrupt the politics in 18th century Britain. In 1690, less than 90 years after the founding of the company, the first case of corporate corruption in world history is registered, and the director of the East India Company is put in the Tower of London because he's actually using money just to bribe MPs to extend the company's monopoly. For the first time, a corporation realizes that MPs can be bought, that you can change politics not by force, but by merely bribery and corruption, something that now is obviously a danger in any democracy, whether it's in America with its vast lobbying operations. The company then realizes you can be cleverer than that still. You can, first of all, ex-company employees returning with fortunes from India become MPs themselves. They buy rotten boroughs, they get elected to Parliament on their return, and they become a body of corporate interest, voting pro-East India Company policies through Parliament. They also realise that half the MPs in Parliament have East India Company shares. And they make it clear to those MPs that it's in their interest to pass certain laws which allows the company to function. So it's a very stark precursor to what goes on quietly behind every democracy today. That the money from corporate entities flow, often unregistered, into political parties and alter the policies of government. Whatever your position on the farmers' protests and everything last year, there's no question that the government was producing a series of policies which favoured large companies. Why? Because the large companies have funded the election campaigns. That's not unique to India. That happens in other democracies too, and it happened and it was invented by the East India Company. So you've got two fronts in which the East India Company are fighting. First, they're fighting Tipu, the Marathas and so on, but secondly, they're fighting their own governments. I'll just quickly wrap up to allow the questions to take place and the discussion. Next slide. This is the flag of the East India Company. It was the model for the Union flag in America after the American Revolution. Next slide is the director's board. No, it's the front of the East India Company offices, much larger now. It looks a bit like Buckingham Palace by 1800. It's the richest corporation in the world. Next slide. And here is the director's boardroom from which India is controlled. Today it's controlled from Racecourse Road. In 1820 it's controlled from this room in London. Next slide. Meanwhile, the company docks are bringing in opium, tea and other goods from all over the world. Next slide. While further down the river at Brunswick, you have this manufacture of the East India Company clippers, which are these very fast armed ships which, like all the jets lined up at IGI Airport, will go out around the world making profit for everybody involved in the company. Next slide. It all goes on until 1857. A lot of the events taking place in 1857 on the ground we're now standing on. The Mutiny Memorial is only 10 minutes away. The British camp for 1857 was Hindu Rao's Hospital is one of the angles. You're actually standing on the ground where the company nearly gets expelled in 1857 in the largest anti-colonial revolt to take place anywhere in the world. In the end, the sepoys do not succeed because they're disorganized, they haven't got any figure to rally around, and the Sikhs and the Pashtuns sign up with the company and take the city in September 1857, despite terrific resistance. There are then massive killings and hangings. Next slide. And anyone involved in the uprising is tracked down, hunted down, and killed. Maybe 100,000 innocent people are killed. And such a scandal is the massive scale of this bloodshed on both sides that Parliament finally decides to wrap up the company in 1858. Next slide. And here's the Punch cartoon. Nepotism, avarice, misgovernment, supineness is the cartoon, with the East India Company House, the same building we saw in the slide 2 slides ago, being blown from the mouth of a cannon as if it was a mutinous sepoy. I'll just end the next slide with a picture of Warren Hastings. When he's put on trial in his impeachment, the Chancellor of the Exchequer stands before Parliament and he says, corporations have neither bodies to be punished nor souls to be condemned. They therefore do as they like. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for that insightful presentation. Now we would... While reading your work, I have realized that you make history very interesting for the masses. So, sir, I'd like to ask, how do you do that? How do you change that when the common perception of history is that of a dead discipline? And I would like you to answer with reference to history writing.
So there's no law that history has to be dull. Where I come from, we always enjoyed our history lessons, and we dreaded the maths and the engineering and the physics and the chemistry and looked forward to history. I do think India has had a problem whereby Indian academic historians have written only for each other, often in very difficult language. So for example, the most valorized and talked up historians, I think probably in recent Indian history, have been the Subaltern Study Collective, who have done wonderful work bringing the marginalized into focus and study, but they've written it in language which needs a PhD in jargon to understand. Quite unnecessarily complicated and up its own fundament, to be honest. And doesn't, there's nothing in the human sciences that can't be expressed clearly. It's not like it's, rocket science or chemistry or higher algebra. Anything in human experience can be expressed with great simplicity and clarity. And often, in my view, the mark of real brilliance is to express the complex simply, not to make the complex more complicated still. With technical subjects, clearly that's sometimes unavoidable, but not in history, not in art history, not in English literature. So this tendency, I think, in academia to consider that the more complicatedly you write something, the more pure or serious your work is I think, something which has done great damage in this country. And people have been put off history. The textbooks are very boring. The non-fiction books are very boring. And as a result, WhatsApp University has taken over the study of history. And any idiot on Twitter will tell you every sort of nonsense about the deep complexity of Indian history, which is full of nuance and surprise. And yet is often turned into a very simple sort of black and white situation of heroes and villains. And so I think the academic establishment here have got something to answer for. If you go to Harvard, or, you said you were all at the Jaipur Literature Festival, you have there a series of amazing professors from around the world, from Harvard, Yale, LSE, Oxbridge, who write history in an accessible manner. Mark David Baer was there talking about the Ottomans with incredible clarity. He's spent years in the Ottoman archives, but he's chosen to write his book in a manner that's comprehensible and literate. Look, we had the year before Stephen Greenblatt, arguably the world's greatest Shakespearean, the author of The Swerve, a fantastic study of the Renaissance, #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, won the Pulitzer Prize, the greatest reviews with it, but he's a professor at Harvard. So there's nothing I think there's been a sort of mindset here whereby for history to be serious, it has to be inaccessible, which is simply not the case. And there is so much great history writing out there. I think it's changing now. You're getting writers like Manu Pillai, Anirudh Kanasetti, Aramukoti writing accessible history. But I'm not talking about popular history. Serious, award-winning history can be written accessibly, clearly, and amusingly. And there is no rule that it has to be wrapped up in jargon and an effort to read, frankly. And it seems to me that it's beginning to change, but about time too.
for that answer, and we're very sure that if you would be our history teacher, we'd be more interested in history. We all would be. Also, due to time constraints, we'll just take one audience question. So please raise your hands. Also, please keep it short.
My question is, what are your views on women of India being quite sidelined and overlooked in the narratives of the colonial history?
Say the question again. What is my view of the women of India being silenced?
Like sidelined and quite overlooked.
Sidelined.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's not just in colonial history. I think women obviously have been sidelined in all patriarchal societies throughout history. Societies where women have had prominent roles are rare. And obviously this is one of the great revolutions of our time, that this is changing now, and that women run everything, can run anything, and run governments around the world. I mean, Victorian Britain had a queen. Queen Victoria was, so it's not like there was no representation of women and no power for women anywhere. As I say, I don't think it's a specifically colonial thing, it's a patriarchal issue anywhere in the world. It's only in the 20th century really that we've seen women getting the education they deserve and rising to the positions they can achieve.
So with this, we conclude this session and also this edition of Compass. These 2 days have indeed been a source of rich discussions. Over to you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your address. Now I'd like to call upon Tanish Kedam, the President of the Society, to facilitate, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. If anybody wants a book signed, I'll be out by the bookstore outside, and anyone with any questions can ask them then.